The midday heat beat down fiercely as I crouched alongside Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rose plants, my hands already smeared with mud and sweat pouring down my brow. At 27, I believed I had my life sorted out with a good job at an accounting firm, a consistent girlfriend named Sarah, and a predictable routine that kept me within society's standards. But when I kneeled in Eleanor Henderson's garden observing her delicate movements as she cared for her flowers, I felt something change inside me that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Eleanor, 43, was a widow who had lost her husband in a vehicle accident 2 years before, shaking the entire neighborhood. She resided in the colonial house adjacent to my apartment complex, and I offered to help with her garden after witnessing her struggle with the heavier chores. It looked like the neighborly thing to do. What I hadn't expected was how my heart raced every time she smiled at me, or how I found myself looking forward to our Saturday gardening sessions with a fervor bordering on addiction. "You're getting dirt all over your good clothes." She continued, her voice calm and concerned, causing my chest to clench. She was dressed in a modest yellow sundress with little white flowers, and her auburn hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, revealing the lovely contour of her neck. Something about the way the light reflected in her emerald eyes made me forget about everything else, including my work girlfriend and the mound of tax returns on my desk. "I don't mind," I said, attempting to maintain a steady voice as I moved the earth around the rose roots. "The shrubs are worth getting messy for. They are wonderful." Eleanor paused in her weeding, a faint smile forming at the corners of her lips. "My grandma planted them when she first came here in 1952. Robert always said that they were the reason he fell in love with this mansion." Her look became melancholy, and I noticed her thumb absently twisting the wedding ring she was still wearing. The mention of her late husband should have reminded me of the boundaries, the respect I due his memory, and the social protocols that governed exchanges like ours. Instead, I felt a strong stab of jealousy for a dead man who had had the joy of waking up next Eleanor every morning, seeing her hair spread across a pillow, and receiving those gentle smiles. I said, he had good taste, and immediately regretted my words. The double meaning hung in the air between us, and I noticed Eleanor's cheeks get slightly crimson. "Yes," she replied gently. "He did." We worked in silence for a long, the tension between us building like electricity before a storm. Every unintentional contact of our hands as we grabbed for the same tool sent shockwaves through my body. Every time she stooped down to examine a plant, I caught a glimpse of the curvature of her waist and the way her dress swayed with her body, and I had to force myself to look away before my mind wandered off into trouble. Eleanor stood up and brushed the dirt off her knees, saying, "I should probably get some water. Would you like any lemonade? I made it fresh this morning." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and watched her move towards the home. The way she walked, confident and feminine, had a hypnotic effect on me, and she was utterly unconscious of it. As she walked out the back door, I leaned back on my heels, trying to compose myself. This was perilous territory. Eleanor Henderson was my neighbor, a widow who was still grieving her husband, while I was a guy in a committed relationship with someone else. The fact that I spent my Saturday afternoons thinking about her smile rather than my fiancé should have raised a huge red flag. But there was something about Eleanor that drew me in like a moth to a flame, making all of my careful planning and moral certainty appear suddenly vulnerable. When she returned with 2 glasses of lemonade, her hair had fallen out of its ponytail, and a few strands framed her face in a way that made my pulse skip. She handed me the glass, and our fingertips touched during the exchange. Neither of us backed away immediately. "You know," she added, sitting on the garden bench and sipping her lemonade, "I really appreciate you helping me with all of this. I know you've got better things to do on your weekends." I said, "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," and the candor in my tone astonished me. Her eyes twitched with surprise or comprehension of the deeper significance underlying my remarks. For a minute we sat there looking at each other, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging heavily in the June breeze. Then she looked away, her attention falling on the shrubs we'd been maintaining. "Robert used to enjoy working in the garden," she explained, her voice lower now. "He claimed that was the only location where he could think straight. Sometimes I come out here in the evenings simply to be near to him again." The mention of her spouse hit me like a cold shower of water, reminding me of all the reasons why the feelings I was thinking were wrong. But even as guilt twisted in my gut, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was starting between us. Something that would change everything if we allowed it. As the afternoon progressed, we returned to our work, but the atmosphere had changed. Every discussion felt filled with hidden significance, and every glance lingered for too long. When Eleanor asked me to assist her with moving a big planner, I found myself standing behind her, my hands on either side of hers as we lifted it together. The aroma of her perfume, something light and floral, overwhelmed my senses, and I had to resist the impulse to draw closer and breathe her in. As we moved the planter to its new location, she turned to face me, and we were suddenly standing very close enough that I could see the specks of gold in her green eyes, close enough that if I moved just an inch closer, our lips would brush. The pause stretched between us, tense with potential and peril. I could see the quick rise and fall of her chest and feel the heat radiating from her flesh. Everything in me wanted to bridge the gap, to finally give in to the attraction that had been building for weeks. But instead, I took a step back, establishing distance that seemed both essential and terrible. I should probably go home. I murmured, my voice rougher than I wanted. Sarah is making dinner tonight. The mention of my girlfriend's name lingered in the air like an accusation. Eleanor nodded, but I saw a glimpse of something. Disappointment? Relief. That flashed across her face before she could collect herself. Of sure, she replied, her tone perfectly neutral. Thank you again for all your assistance. Same time next Saturday, I agreed, knowing I should say no. Knowing that returning would only complicate matters, but the prospect of not seeing her again, of giving up these stolen afternoons in her garden, was intolerable. As I walked home, dirt lingering under my fingernails and the aroma of her perfume on my clothes, I attempted to convince myself that nothing had happened. We were merely neighbors who helped each other out. The anxiety I felt was all imagined, the result of too much sun and insufficient sleep. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Something had changed between Eleanor and me that afternoon, something that could not be reversed with good intentions or moral reasoning. And when I laid in bed next to Sarah that night, listening to her breathing and staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's emerald eyes and the way she looked at me when we were standing together in her garden. The germ of something hazardous had been placed, and I could feel it growing. The following Saturday couldn't arrive quickly enough. Throughout the week, I was distracted at work, making careless spreadsheet errors and overlooking critical facts during customer meetings. Sarah observed my distraction during our Wednesday dinner date and said that I seemed to be somewhere else totally. If only she realized how right she was. I arrived at Eleanor's house earlier than usual, telling myself it was only to get a jump on the garden work. The fact was that I had been up since sunrise, obsessed by both eagerness and guilt in equal measure. Eleanor answered the door in a pale blue sundress that matched her eyes wonderfully, and I had to clutch the gardening tools tightly to keep my hands steady. "You're early," she replied, but her voice was pleasant, implying she didn't mind. I admitted that I couldn't sleep, but then regretted it. It exposed too much. She looked at my face for a time, and I noticed an understanding spark in her expression. "Neither could I," she responded gently. For the first hour, we worked side by side, conversing carefully about commonplace matters, such as the weather, neighborhood gossip, and the progress of her tomatoes. But there was an undercurrent, electric and menacing, that made every simple interaction feel meaningful. When she asked me to help stake a climbing rose that had become too heavy for its trellis, I found myself standing behind her again, my arms stretching around her to secure the vine. "Is this too tight?" I wondered, tightening the garden wire that held the rose in place. "It's great," she said quietly, and something about her tone made me pause. She hadn't stepped away or created the gap that decorum required. Instead, she leaned back slightly, and I felt the warmth of her body on mine for a brief instant before my conscience took over, and I backed away. The morning went in a blur of fleeting looks and unintentional touches. Every time our hands brushed as we reached for the same tool, and every time she smiled at anything I said, I felt myself sink further into something I couldn't identify. It wasn't just about the attraction, though it certainly played a role. It was the way she listened when I talked about my work problems, as if she actually cared about my thoughts and opinions. Sarah had stopped actually listening to me months ago, and our chats had become more about practicalities and habit. Around midday, Eleanor recommended we take a lunch break. She had made sandwiches and iced tea, and we sat on her back porch, shaded by the old oak tree that dominated her yard. The conversation shifted to more intimate themes, such as her life before Robert's death and my own concerns about the future. "Do you ever feel as if you're living someone else's life?" she inquired abruptly, her emerald eyes fastened on mine with such intensity that my breath caught. What do you mean? Do you ever wake up and wonder how you got where you are? Whether the decisions you made were truly yours or if you simply followed the path expected of you? Her query hit closer to home than I felt comfortable revealing. My relationship with Sarah began in college, and it was easy and anticipated. My employment was solid but unfulfilling. My entire life had been shaped by other people's assumptions of what I should want and what would make me happy. I said gently, "Do you do this sometimes?" Eleanor groaned with such longing that my chest ached. Robert and I married when I was 22. He was a good man and a beautiful spouse, but I sometimes wonder who I may have been if I had more time to find myself out first. I went straight from my father's house to my husband's house, and she was now gesturing blankly at the empty space surrounding her. Now that I'm 43 years old, I feel like I'm just learning who I truly am. There was something raw and vulnerable about her revelation that made me want to grab for her hand and offer comfort beyond words. Instead, I grasped my iced drink tightly, attempting to keep the shaky limits we'd created. "You're still young," I said. 43 is not old." She laughed, but the sound conveyed grief. "Tell it to the mirror. Tell that to all the years I've felt like I wasted by being who everyone else wanted me to be rather than who I really wanted to be. Who do you wish to be?" The question hovered between us with implications that made my heart accelerate. Eleanor gave me a long look, and I noticed a shift in her expression, as if she was making a decision or approaching a line. I want to be someone who takes chances and does not let fear dictate her decisions. The afternoon heat seemed to build around us, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. We both understood we were discussing more than just life philosophy. When we returned to our gardening labor, the atmosphere had entirely shifted. Every movement felt purposeful, and every word had weight. Eleanor invited me to help her plant new bulbs in the bed outside her bedroom window, and as we worked side by side, our talk became more personal. "Robert wanted children," she murmured abruptly, her hands resting on the soil. I wasn't sure if I was prepared, and we kept putting it off, thinking we had time. "After he died, I discovered that not all possibilities wait for you to be ready. Do you regret it?" "Not having children." "Sometimes, but mostly, I regret not living more fully when I had the opportunity. I was so anxious about doing the right thing and fulfilling expectations that I failed to ask myself what I really wanted." Her statements echoed my own growing dissatisfaction, my sensation that I was sleepwalking through a life that didn't suit me. She gazed up at me as if she could read my thoughts. "How about you? Are you pleased with Sarah?" The question should have been off limits, too personal, too risky, but Eleanor's tone made it feel like a confession booth, a secure zone where honesty was not only tolerated but encouraged. I admitted softly, but lately I'm not sure what happiness feels like. Eleanor nodded as if she knew exactly what I meant. When Robert died, everyone told me how fortunate I was to have had such a good marriage and such a stable existence, and I was grateful for it. But I also recognized that stable and happy are not always synonymous. As the day progressed, our efforts led us to the far corner of her garden, which was partially hidden from the house and street by large hedges. Everything changed while we attempted to eradicate a section of wild weeds. Eleanor was working with a particularly hard root when her palms slipped, causing her to stumble backwards. I grabbed her reflexively, placing my arms around her waist to keep her steady. For a minute, we stood frozen, her back against my chest, my face near enough to her neck to smell her shampoo. She mumbled, "Thank you," but did not pull away. Instead, she turned into my arms, and we were face to face, closer than we had ever been. I could see every fleck of gold in her emerald eyes and counted the freckles on her nose. Her lips were barely parted, and I could feel her warm breath on my skin. "We should," I began to say, but the words died in my mouth as she reached up and caressed my face, her fingertips tracing the line of my jaw with such tenderness that my knees buckled. "Should what?" she asked quietly. I couldn't respond since I wasn't sure what we should do. Every sensible portion of my brain was shouting warnings, telling me of all the reasons why this was wrong and how it could only end badly. But Eleanor's touch felt like coming home, like waking up after a long, dreamless night. "If only I were younger," she sighed, her gaze fixed on mine. "What if I were 25 again? What if I'd met you then?" "Age is irrelevant," I remarked, and I meant it. Not for me. Something changed in her expression. Hope, dread, and want all came together in a way that took my breath away. For a moment, I thought she was going to kiss me. I could see the desire in her eyes and felt the tension in her body as she leaned in. The magic was broken, however, when a car door smashed nearby. Eleanor took a rapid step back. Her cheeks flushed, her breathing unsteady. We both peered down the street, but it was merely a neighbor returning from grocery shopping. Nonetheless, the moment was broken, and reality returned with stark clarity. I was involved with someone else. Eleanor was a widow who still wore her wedding ring. We both knew we were playing with fire. I should leave, I replied, despite the fact that every fiber of my being wanted to stay to close the gap between us once more, no matter the repercussions. Eleanor nodded, but I could see struggle in her eyes. Same time next week, I knew I needed to say no. I realized that continuing these Saturday afternoons would only make things more confusing and hazardous. But I also knew I couldn't stay away, and the prospect of not seeing her again was awful. Yes, I mentioned next week. As I walked home, my hands trembling and my pulse beating, I attempted to comprehend what had almost happened. We hadn't kissed or violated any physical borders that couldn't be undone, but something basic had changed between us that no amount of good intentions or moral thinking could undo. That night, Sarah excitedly discussed our upcoming vacation, the restaurant reservations she had made, and the activities she had studied. I nodded and smiled in the appropriate places, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Replaying every moment of the afternoon, every word Eleanor had spoken, every look we had exchanged. When Sarah fell asleep beside me, I remained awake, staring at the ceiling, aware that I was at a crossroads. I could step back now, create distance, and let whatever was developing between Eleanor and me fade into a pleasant memory. Or I could continue down this path knowing that it would most likely destroy everything I had achieved in my life thus far. The sensible choice was evident and the safe choice was clear. But as I drifted off to sleep, all I could think of were emerald eyes and Eleanor's comment, "If only I were younger," as if age was the only thing standing between us and something lovely. The week felt like a fever dream. Every day presented a new internal conflict between my conscience and my wants. I found myself creating excuses to pass by Eleanor's house on my way to work, hoping to get a glimpse of her tending to her flowers. I began picturing talks we could have, scenarios in which the obstacles between us simply vanished. Sarah observed my distraction worsening, and by Thursday, she was asking pointed questions about where my mind had been recently. "You're acting strangely," she murmured over supper, holding her fork halfway to her mouth. "You seem distant, as if you are constantly thinking about something else." "Just work stress." I lied, afraid to meet her gaze. The guilt was consuming me, but the alternative, telling her the truth, was inconceivable. Friday night, while I lay in bed with Sarah, I made a decision. I'd go to Eleanor's one last time, help her finish the piece of garden we'd been working on, and then make some space. Maybe I'd volunteer for weekend overtime at the accounting business, or advise Sarah and I start taking weekend trips out of town, anything to break the hazardous cycle that had created. But when Saturday morning came, my resolve crumbled as soon as Eleanor opened her door. She wore a white sundress that made her skin glow, and her hair was loose over her shoulders in lovely waves. More importantly, there was something different in her eyes, a determination that had never been present before. "All week I've been thinking about what you said about age not mattering." My heart began racing. "Eleanor, no, let me finish." She turned to face me, her emerald eyes flashing with such intensity that it stole my breath away. "I've spent the last 2 years grieving Robert, and I spent the previous 20 years being the ideal wife. I am tired of living up to other people's expectations. I am tired of being terrified." We worked quietly for the first hour, but the tension between us was evident. Every unintentional touch transmitted electricity across my system. Every time she smiled at something I said, I felt my carefully built walls crumble a little further. When she asked me to assist her with moving a big stone border, I found myself standing close behind her, my hands covering hers as we lifted together. This time, she did not back away when the assignment was completed. Instead, she leaned into me, her body warm and soft against my chest. I mumbled, "This is dangerous," but my arms tightened around her waist as I said it. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible, but I'm 43 years old and tired of playing it safe. She turned into my arms and we were face to face again, closer than we'd ever been. I could see my own need in her eyes, and I could feel her chest rise and fall rapidly against mine. The sensible half of my brain was shouting warnings, but they were drowned out by the pounding of my heart. "We can't," I stated, but my words lacked conviction. "Can't we?" She asked, her hand resting on my chest. "Who says we cannot?" The solution seemed obvious. Society morals my girlfriend, sleeping well at home, and her late husband's memory. But standing there in the shadow of her garden hedge with the early sun shining through the leaves, and Eleanor looking at me as if I were the answer to every prayer she'd never dared to ask, those barriers appeared unexpectedly flimsy. What about Sarah, my final attempt at doing the right thing? Eleanor's expression shifted. Perhaps we feel guilty or we recognize the hurt we have caused. But then her jaw tightened with determination. "What about her?" she inquired. "Are you pleased with her? Are you really happy?" The question hovered between us like a challenge. I could lie and pretend my relationship with Sarah was everything I wanted it to be, but Eleanor's gaze demanded honesty, and I realized I was incapable of falsehood. "No," I said, "I'm not." The admission was like crossing a line from which there could be no return. Eleanor's gaze softened and she gently touched my face, making my knees weak. "So why are we condemning ourselves for seeking something real?" she wondered. Before I could respond, she rose on her toes and mashed her lips on mine. The kiss began softly and tentatively, as if she was giving me a chance to draw away. But I couldn't draw away any longer. All the weeks of strain, all the secret looks and careful distances culminated in a desperate hunger that overwhelmed every sensible thought. I kissed her back with unexpected ferocity, my hands tangled in her hair as she moved closer to me. She tasted of sunshine and potential like every fantasy I'd been terrified to admit. When we eventually parted ways, both of us were breathing heavily and I could see tears in her eyes. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," she said, her voice cracking. "So have I admitted. And the truth was both liberating and terrifying. We stood there clutching each other's foreheads, trying to grasp what had happened. The kiss had changed everything, making it hard to pretend that our feelings for each other were purely harmless infatuation. "What should we do now?" I inquired, dreading the response. Eleanor remained quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing patterns on my chest. "I don't know," she finally said. "I have never been in this situation before. Robert was my first and only." She didn't continue the phrase and she didn't have to. The weight of what she was telling me, that I would be the first man she'd been with since her husband died, and possibly the second man in her whole life, struck me like a physical blow. "Eleanor, if you aren't ready, I am," she stated firmly, looking up at me with confident eyes. "I am more prepared than I have ever been for anything in my life." The following hour was a flurry of passionate kisses and murmured confessions. We attempted to concentrate on the garden work, but it was futile. Every task became an occasion to touch one another. Every interaction became filled with double meanings. When Eleanor recommended we take a lunch break, I knew we were nearing the end. The atmosphere within her house was electrifying. Eleanor went around the kitchen making sandwiches, but her hands were trembling and I could see a quick pulse at the base of her throat. I sat at her kitchen table trying to comprehend the enormity of what was happening between us. "Do you have second thoughts?" she inquired, placing a plate in front of me. "How about kissing you?" "No. How does this affect the rest of our lives?" "Yes." Eleanor sat across from me, her green eyes serious. "I realize this is complicated. I understand that we are both taking significant risks, but I also know that I cannot go back to pretending I do not care about you. What about our neighbors? How about your reputation?" "My reputation." She laughed, but the sound was painful. "My reputation is as a heartbroken widow who spends her days alone in her garden. Is that truly preferable to being the lady who discovered love again?" Her statements impacted me deeply because they pushed me to confront my own hypocrisy. I was concerned about her reputation and what others would say, but my main concern was my own comfort and safety. Eleanor was willing to sacrifice everything for this emotion between us, while I was still weighing the costs and repercussions. After lunch, we returned to the garden, but the illusion of working had worn thin. Each touch was deliberate,